Dear church, let's talk about grieving with God. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley, and we are continuing our series on good grief with today my good friend Michael Whitworth, and I'm so grateful that he has agreed to join us today. Michael, thank you so much for being here. I know that this is a heavy topic and one that's really hits home with you, and but I've also always appreciated your willingness to share this story and being vulnerable and helping others through your grief seminars and just one-on-one conversation. So I can't thank you enough for being here. And since the last time we talked, you have, well, I wouldn't say the last time we talked, but a fairly new addition to the family, right?
Absolutely, yeah. My daughter Autumn was born late, about the middle of last year, and she's almost 9 months old. So
fantastic.
That's been a great joy.
So that gives you 3 girls at home, but including Sarah.
That's right.
Yeah. Not including Sarah, so 4 total. So do you feel like you're a little bit outnumbered, I guess, now?
Oh, absolutely. I felt that way for quite a while. Yeah. But we make do. We make do.
I always said when we had 1, we could double team. When we had 2, we had to go to a man-to-man, and then when we had 3, we had to play zone. And so that's probably that's kind of what you're doing now. And so
that's right.
Michael, so you're we were talking about this before we came on. You're kind of at a standstill right now because you've been traveling doing these seminars and things like that, and so you're hoping this whole thing gets this pandemic gets over with soon, so you can get out and do that again. And I know you do a great work with that. And I love the time that you came on and shared with us about grief and how we are, as you said, a grief illiterate culture. And I want to talk a little bit about that. First, before we jump into that, though, I'd like you to, just tell us the story and the reason why, we wanted you to come and share with us today, about Daniel, your son, and his passing. And if you wouldn't mind kind of walking us through that, and we can, talk about some of your struggles from there and how faith has gotten you through it, if that's okay.
Well, I guess, it began in December of 2015. It was a Monday. I had gotten a call about right just after lunchtime. My wife had called me. Our kids were in daycare 2 days a week, and our son had gotten sick at daycare, and so I had to leave work and go pick them up and take them home. And he seemed to be fine, other than just being puny. Mm-hmm. He had just a little bit of a fever, 100, 101. Again, parents, your kids have fever all the time. You don't really worry about that sort of thing. But I last saw him alive at 11:30 that Monday night, and went to bed. And my wife came running in about 2 hours later saying he wasn't breathing. And I immediately bolted up wide awake and ran in to do CPR on him. She called 911, and they came in, and the medics came and tried to revive him. They took him to the emergency room. They tried to revive him there. They were never successful in that. About an hour after we had found him unresponsive, he was pronounced dead. In hindsight of all of that, I think that he had already passed when I first got to him. He showed no signs of life whatsoever. Right. And the coroner, a medical examiner, nobody had any idea what happened. Basically the only report that came back was he had a cold, which we already knew. And as the medical examiner told my wife, you don't die from a cold. Right. So to this day, we have no idea why he passed away. Yeah. He was only 3 months shy of his 3rd birthday. Some people think it's SIDS, but SIDS actually goes up to 2 years. And then at that point, from I think 24 months all the way up to age 18, it's what they call sudden unexplained death of a child, which is a fancy way of saying your kid died and we don't know why. We're going to lump it into this category. So,
yeah. So from that time till now, Michael, what has life been like? I know you've shared with me before it's ups and downs, but you are a man of God, a man of faith, been a Christian your whole life, been taken to church your whole life, been a Christian for many, many years. What does that do to your faith and your relationship with God?
I had been through grief before with my dad, but losing a parent, losing a child are in no way the same thing at all. And I made the mistake of thinking that it would be. I made the mistake of just thinking, and this path will be similar, and it decidedly was not. And that was my first mistake. One particular way in which it's very different. For a lot of people, for a lot of different types of loss, the first year is the most difficult. And then after you get past that 1 year mark, things for the most part seem to get a little easier. Whereas for both my wife and I, and in both of our experiences, the first year didn't even hold a candle to how difficult the second year was.
Really?
And I can't really explain all the reasons why that was, but that was my experience, that in many ways the second year was worse than the first. The first year was awful, but the second year proved to be even more difficult. And even now, several years removed, I'm not entirely sure why that is, but it was certainly a completely different experience than my first rodeo with grief. And you have to give it time. It is a cliche, time heals all wounds, but there is some truth to that. Yeah. You really do. You have to give it time. But unfortunately, as many people can attest, you could say to some degree that you get over the death of a loved one. I really don't think that's true, but we do say that. But you never get over the death of a child. And I've had a lot of people who have lost children tell me that, and I can easily understand why. Oftentimes, as I have tried to explain grief to people, and more specifically the grief of losing a child, because you and I are both football fans, and if any of your viewers are football fans, they'll get this. So in 2011, Peyton Manning did not play the entire NFL season because he had injured his neck. And suddenly the Colts go from, having been in the Super Bowl 2 seasons prior and in the playoffs the season before, they finished with the absolute worst record in the NFL. In fact, they were winless going into the latter weeks of the season. I think they finished 1-15 or 2-14, something like that. Yeah. And obviously a lot of people commented that, well, this is just how good Peyton Manning is, that he was so talented, he covered up for a lot of the weaknesses of what evidently was a very bad team without him playing under center. Right. Well, I've likened that for a lot of people to dealing with grief, in that when loss comes into your life, suddenly the simplest things become that much more difficult. Yeah. Dealing with what would normally be just a stressful situation becomes that much more difficult. Getting things done, things accomplished, becomes that much more difficult. Suddenly for the Colts in 2011, they were winning automatically 10, 11, 12 games every season. And now it seems like getting a touchdown is a tremendous challenge, let alone winning a ball game and putting wins together. And so when you lose a child, and this is true of other types of loss, but especially when you lose a child, you discover that doing the simplest things suddenly becomes very, very challenging and very, very trying. It takes a lot of energy out of you. You don't have the ability to handle certain things like you once did. Yeah. You're handicapped in some way now, and it's very, very frustrating. I know on many occasions I knew that I was perhaps overreacting or hyper emotional about something, and would beat myself up or give myself a guilt trip for being a snowflake. When looking back, the reality was I was already emotionally spent over losing my son, grieving his loss, that I didn't have the ability to cope with things that under any other circumstance I would have been just fine. I would have been a reasonable, rational adult. And so, again, losing a child, it just makes everything in life harder. Yeah. And, I wish I could say it gets a little bit easier. I guess in some ways it does, but at this point, I'm sitting at, not quite 4.5 years later, and it's still very challenging at times to get the simplest things accomplished or to move past various obstacles. Yeah.
Michael, tell me a little bit about what your conversations with God have been like, especially right after it happened. Did you wrestle with your faith? I mean, I know you well enough to know that giving up on God was never an option, but what were those? What was your prayer life like, and what has it been like since?
Well, as far as what I said to God, this is probably a rated G audience, so I won't go into complete specifics.
Sure.
And you're being a little bit generous when you say walking away from God was never an option. I guess I'd say it was probably never an option that I seriously entertained.
Yeah.
However, I can't say it never crossed my mind, because it did.
Yeah.
As far as what you say to God, everything gets put on the table. And I'll reference this, and this may shock some people in your audience, and if they are offended by this, I will apologize in advance. But
Sure.
Bury a kid and then come talk to me.
Yeah.
So I'm a huge fan of The West Wing, the TV show that was popular in the 2000s. And at the end of season 2, there's a scene in which the president, he's just lost his secretary to a car accident, and he's having to wrestle with a bunch of stuff. And after the funeral for his secretary in the National Cathedral, he has the Secret Service seal the cathedral, and he has this conversation with God in the cathedral, looking up at the crucifix there at the front of the cathedral. And most of the conversation is in Latin, and there are no subtitles. You have to Google the translation. But the conversation begins, and this is very blasphemous, but he begins the conversation with "You're a real," and then uses a slur. But he says something directly offensive of God. For whatever reason, that phrase has rung in my head and rung in my head and rung in my head. The statement that's made in the book of Job that he did not curse God as his wife wanted him to. Yeah, but then you read the rest of Job, and he comes dangerously close at times.
Absolutely.
Of saying some very insulting things. And you can't help but be floored, blown away, bewildered at why God has allowed this. People try to explain why God allows bad things to happen, etc. People try to explain it in different ways. Did God cause my son's death? Did he not cause my son's death? Really, that's a separate conversation from just what do I think of God because of all that has happened. And the feelings get very, very raw.
Yeah.
I have been planning to be a preacher my entire life. And I got a great education at Free Hardeman. I've done a lot of study over the years, as any minister would. And because of that, as we might say, I know enough to be dangerous.
Right.
And at some point, I often am jealous of people that don't know much. They have a simple faith because then they're not as in much danger. It's easier for them, I think, in some ways. Yeah. But it has not been easy for me, and it's not easy for a lot of people. The conversations get very, very raw, and obviously it's difficult because no one is talking back.
Right.
Certainly we have the scriptures, but this is kind of different. The scriptures do have value in that they give voice to our frustration. Yeah. Even going back to my dad's death, there was a passage that always meant a lot to me. It was in Lamentations 3. Jeremiah, around verse 18, basically comes to the point where he says, my hope in God is gone. I don't know who you are anymore. I have no hope in the Lord anymore. But then he says, I tell myself this, and therefore I have hope. And beginning in verse 22, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. Right. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I'll hope in him. Jeremiah, for lack of a better way of putting it, is engaging in the fake it till you make it approach to healing. My hope in God is gone, he says. I don't know who you are anymore. And bear in mind, Jeremiah knew exactly why Jerusalem is to the ground. Right. He had been preaching the sermons for years.
Sure.
And yet he still, I think a part of him couldn't bring himself to believe that God would actually allow this to happen to the holy city.
Right.
And to try and recover from that grief, he says, I'm just going to tell myself this every morning until I start to believe it again. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases.
Yeah.
And so when it comes, just as it is true with your feelings and your emotions, you have to give it time. So also with your relationship with the Lord, you have to give it time. Now, I can say confidence that my relationship with the Lord now is as good as it's been in the last 4.5 years. But that's in some ways an easy statement to make because it's been pretty poor the last 4.5 years.
Yeah, the standard was pretty low. Huh?
That's right. That's a relative statement, bear in mind. But the discussions get very, very raw. I've often told people that Some Sundays, some Lord's days, the Lord and I are on good terms. I love him. I know that he loves me. But then there's other Lord's days, there's other Sundays where, he and I are like two feuding family members at Thanksgiving. We're in the same building or room, but we're not talking to each other.
Right.
And you have to give it time. You have to realize that I'm not going to feel this way about the Lord every day. And you do have to take it one day at a time, one moment at a time. The Bible has helped me give voice to my frustration, whether it be in the Psalms, whether it be in Job, whether it be in Habakkuk. It gives voice to my frustration. It helps me see the examples of people who went through very similar circumstances and how they overcome it. It also helps too, and this is probably something that I would say is the most important thing people take away from our conversation. I went into this experience convinced that God can handle anything we say to him in prayer if we say it to him. Yeah. I was brought up in a church culture. My dad, as my preacher, didn't teach this, but a lot of people that I grew up around in church advocated this or believed this. You just don't say certain things to the Lord because, again, it's blasphemous, it's offensive, etc. Whereas you look at Job and the Psalms and other passages, I think the Lord can handle anything we say to him because he recognizes the honesty. Yeah. Two of my favorite passages are, first of all, the one in Psalms where it talks about how that he remembers that we are dust.
Yes.
And then also in Matthew, I believe, chapter 12, the quote from the prophets that, he's not going to extinguish smoldering wicks or break off bruised reeds. The Lord understands our weakness. He understands our weakness because Christ, in his humanity and putting on his humanity, is now able to stand at the Father's right hand and intercede for us. We have a faithful and merciful high priest who sympathizes with our weaknesses, knows how to deal gently with us. These beliefs, these truths that I had heard throughout my life suddenly became very necessary to put into practice. Yeah. And so the scriptures have helped me find myself and find my way through this, horrible new landscape where everything seems different. It's very disorienting to try and recover the pieces of your faith, and it's not possible to put the pieces back together because some of the pieces are missing. Yeah. But time and in Scripture. The other thing I would mention is it's impossible to survive. It's impossible for your faith to survive the loss of a child unless you stay tethered to his people. Yeah. I tell people, as long as you're willing to hold the hand of the Lord and the Lord's people, there's nothing that you can't overcome. Right. There's a lot of things that you can say negative about the church. Quite frankly, some of those criticisms we bring on ourselves. True. But one thing that cannot be placed at our feet is that we don't take care of our own, because we do. Yeah. We do a tremendous job of taking care of our own. And I have seen that evidenced in countless ways. Even in the midst of this current, pandemic situation, we have seen the church take care of its own in countless ways. There are good deeds being done by God's people that will never be known about until eternity. And so it is imperative that you allow your church family to support you in the aftermath of losing a child, because if you don't, if you withdraw, withdrawing into isolation is so incredibly easy in these types of situations. But if you will refuse to withdraw into isolation, if you will refuse to allow Satan to drag you down into the pit, as Psalms talks about, give it time and you're going to be okay.
Yeah. And, you said something there that I actually wanted to hit on. I appreciate it. You doing that. Is that everybody, it's kind of like what Mike Tyson, I believe, said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And, I think folks who have not been in this situation, who have not experienced grief on this level, I think it's easy for them to sit back and say, well, yeah, you can't say that to God. Or, they want to intellectualize, the grief and the suffering, and they want to offer their theories and why God did this and all that. And what you find in the Psalms, especially with David, and like you said with Job and Lamentations, what you find is some very raw, real emotion that says, I don't know what you're doing. I can't figure it out. And you even find that there's some anger and things like that. It's like Ralph Gilmore said one time, in a kind of the same situation, have you told God? And they're like, well, you can't tell God that. And why? He already knows your heart. He already knows what's, and so I think you're right. I think, being vulnerable and sharing those things with God, I think is important. It's obviously helped with your healing. Talk a little bit about that, though. Talk a little bit about how we try to, do our best to be tough and to be strong and to move forward. That's what our culture teaches. The funeral's over, you're done. You're over it, you move on. And that is absolutely not the case. Some of the things we say, some of the things that we do, talk a little bit about that and, going through this grieving process and, having to kind of overcome, maybe some outside interference, but also just dealing with, kind of the unforeseen.
Some practical things I think are very, very necessary. Counseling, I'm a huge fan of counseling. I have been in and out of counseling for several years, but especially very intensely since my son passed away.
Yeah.
Times when I am not doing well, I can draw a direct line to having not been to counseling in a while or something similar. More specifically, I believe that every couple that loses a child needs to begin marital counseling immediately after the loss.
Yeah.
Don't wait 6 months. Don't wait 3 months. Don't wait until the first big drag knockdown fight. They need to begin marital counseling immediately. 70% of couples that lose a child end up divorcing. I can tell you exactly how it happens.
Yeah.
And so as a result, that needs to happen. I have noticed in my own experience and in others' experiences, there from time to time, sadly, in our circles, we know of people that lose a child, and I kind of sit back and view their journey on Facebook and things that they post, et cetera. The script, sadly, is often very similar. And there is a tendency very quickly after the loss that if someone else loses his child, you want to jump in and help them. I don't know that a person is emotionally equipped to help someone else through that loss until a lot of time has passed.
Yeah.
4, 5, 6 months later is not enough time. A year later, I don't know, is enough time. 2, 3 years later. Because of that, even 4.5 years later, when I know that someone has lost a child, I don't push myself on them to help them through and all of that. I figure out that, they know me or they have a close friend who knows me. And if I can be of help to them, I'll hear from them at some point when they, apparently are ready. And in the vast majority of cases, that's proven to be a helpful way of keeping that distance, but also being able to help people.
Sure. People
can feel suffocated when you push yourself on them. And so it's important to avoid being the wounded healer too quickly. You need to let some time pass. You need to allow yourself to process some of these things.
It's a good point.
Trying to jump in and help other people so soon after a loss is kind of like trying to date so soon after a divorce. Yeah. You need to let some time pass. You need to allow some emotions to be processed, et cetera. And so I'm a huge fan of counseling. The path forward really doesn't, though, have a roadmap. I wish I could tell people step 1, step 2, step 3. You got to give it time. And there's days still that I'm not doing so well. However, I want to reiterate the importance that faith plays in all of this. Yesterday we celebrated Easter, and even after my dad passed away, I'm not sure that Easter meant nearly as much to me as it does now.
Yeah.
In that the resurrection indeed holds a glorious hope. Whenever I'm reading through a passage in Scripture, a commentary that talks about Jesus defeating death, I get very, very emotional. I can be sitting in the middle of Starbucks, reading, writing, And I come across that thought, that idea that Jesus has conquered the grave. Hebrews 2:14, that he has destroyed death and the devil,
Yeah.
and released us from our fear of death, our lifelong fear of death. I get very emotional. I get very teary-eyed. I start to choke up, and there's not a lot of things that make me do that. But almost without fail, that's what happens.
Yeah.
Because the great hope of our faith is indeed that in Christ, death has no victory. Our son died in early December, and the following spring, March 20th, is his birthday. It was a Sunday that year, his first birthday after his death. And in fact, it was Palm Sunday that year, his birthday. We went to his grave that Sunday after church. And I walked away from his grave and I tweeted something. And little did I know that it would resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah.
So much so that not only a week later did some preachers use the statement in their sermon, Easter sermon there in 2016, but even yesterday, 4 years later, people are still referencing that statement. And the statement that I made on Twitter and Facebook was that if an empty tomb does not excite you, you've never wept beside a grave.
Yeah.
I still continue to be amazed at how much that statement has resonated with people. And yet it gives me a lot of comfort in that it's a reminder that my son's death has helped the faith of many.
Absolutely.
And things of that nature never make it worth it. There's never a point where you say, I'm kind of glad my son died.
Right.
But I can tell you that a lot of healing comes from seeing what God does with our tragic circumstances, how he uses them to help other people who are in need and struggling in their own faith and in their own life. And so the path forward does entail giving yourself time, but recognizing that over the long haul, if you are open to it, God is going to use you to help a lot of people and bless a lot of people. It's still incredibly painful, though, and it'll be painful for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Some people try to soften the blow by saying something really ridiculous to me in that, well, God lost a son too. He knows just how you feel. And I just smile and walk off. But in my mind, I'm going, no, he doesn't. He let Jesus die knowing that he would raise him from the dead every 3 days. I've got to find a way to muddle along for 50 more years without my little boy.
Yeah.
I can't just check out of life right now like I so often have wanted to. I've got 3 little girls at home that are depending upon me.
Yes.
And so I so badly want people to recognize that to some level, I have a miserable existence. I hate every day I wake up without my little boy.
Yeah.
And yes, I find joy in a lot of things, and my 3 girls bring me a lot of joy, but a child is missing, and I can't stand it. Every year when school starts back and people start posting, photos of kindergarten, first grade, I get a little bit wistful. He would have turned 7 just a few weeks ago. I remember 7. I remember doing things with my dad at 7. I love camping. I love going on road trips. I was doing all of that with my dad at 7. And so I think about the fun that he and I would have just as a father and son only can. And so it's incredibly painful, and it will remain painful. But in many ways, I've made my peace with that. I've made my peace with the fact that you can survive living with pain. That the goal of life is not getting to a point where you don't have any pain whatsoever. The point of life is recognizing that regardless of what happens to me, regardless of my circumstances, if I can hold the hand of the Lord, the Lord's people, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And that has proven true in my life the last 4.5 years, and I have every expectation that it will prove true for the next 4 decades plus.
Absolutely. That's really good stuff, Michael. What about your wife? What about Sarah? I mean, how is it grieving the loss of a child and then supporting one another while you're both just kind of emotionally in shambles? I mean, what is that like?
Well, again, first of all, I want to reiterate, marital counseling is just a huge necessity.
Sure.
Losing a child will bring to the surface the most minor of issues that have been lingering in the background of your relationship. Suddenly they get magnified. suddenly they're made so much worse.
Yeah.
But I think one thing that has helped my wife and I endure this, in addition to the counseling and our faith, is that she and I really are that kind of couple that she is strong in all of the ways that I'm weak, and I'm strong in all of the ways that she is weak.
That's good.
And it's proven so often true in our marriage. The times when I'm at my absolute worst, and there's been several of those, she's been able to hang in there and be patient and be supportive. And the few times that she's, I've been able to do that as well. We still go at it, but with time and prayer and help and faith, you find your way again. The reason though, so many couples end up divorcing is not just simply, the death brings up so many other issues that they've never really resolved or dealt with, but it is hard to feel intimate and be close emotionally with one another when your emotions are so raw.
Yeah.
That's incredibly, incredibly difficult. And that's something that takes time. It takes being honest with one another, but at the same time, you have to recognize it's really hard to be affectionate towards one another when you're hurting so badly.
Sure.
There's only so much room in your heart. And when it's being overwhelmed with grief and bitterness, there's not a lot of love to be expressed to other people.
It's all you think about. Yeah.
And you have to, you have to give that, you have to take that into account. And you have to recognize that I'm strong for my spouse for a time, but then hope that they're going to be strong for you when you eventually break down, because it's going to happen. You can't be strong forever.
Right. I like that. Yeah. So, Michael, we called this series "Good Grief," not because we think grief is good, as in and of itself, but that hopefully with God on your side, you get through it and reach a point that is good. I hear people say sometimes, no matter what the situation is, and they take Romans 8:28 out of context, but everything that's bad is really good, and that's not what Paul is saying there. And I don't believe that there's anything good in death. It's the enemy, and it is the last enemy that's been conquered, that Christ has overcome. But I do believe, and I know you do as well, that with God on our side, we can make it through to where there's some good result at the end of it. You talked about that a little bit a while ago, but talk about some of the good that's come from, you talked about drawing closer to God, and talk about that and how your relationship is stronger, maybe some specifics with that and how it's better now.
Certainly my prayer life is, I'm not going to say better, but certainly there's more substance to it.
Yeah.
There is a vibrancy there as a result. It has certainly made me more grateful for the person and work of Christ than perhaps I appreciated in the past. It's easy to live most of your Christian life simply thankful for Jesus, that he died on the cross for your sins. He's given you kind of a get out of hell free card.
Sure.
And everything that goes with that. But the two aspects I've already mentioned, the resurrection, but also his ascension and exaltation, the fact that Christ is now at the right hand of the Father interceding for us. My appreciation for those two parts of Jesus's person and work have significantly increased. And I really believe that last part, the Jesus's exaltation to the Father's right hand, his intercession for us, his high priestly ministry, that's something that I have a feeling is going to pay tremendous dividends for the rest of my life, perhaps more so than any other concept or belief or doctrine that I have studied or had impressed upon me in these last 4.5 years. When it comes to other aspects of my faith, I know that I think I now have a capacity to be infinitely more patient with other people, because I recognize that virtually everyone is broken and damaged and in, maybe a few breaths short of being completely shattered to pieces.
Yeah.
That everybody's dealing with something. Everybody's got a handicap. Some of them are visible and some of them are not. And when you recognize that so many people are broken, just like you are, you want God to cut you a little slack.
Yeah.
And when you recognize that most people are in your same boat, just for different reasons or in different ways, you then have a little bit easier time recognizing you need to cut them some slack as well.
Yeah, Michael, I've not experienced this on the depth that you have. My mother passed away suddenly in 2014. We didn't always have the greatest relationship. We were doing pretty good, though, at the time she passed. But she lived alone. She was, found, she had passed for a while when they found her. And it changes you from a theoretical view of Scripture, if that's kind of what you want to say, to a very personal view. You seem, we as members of the church, we feel like, one of the things that we pride ourselves in is our knowledge of the Word of God, and that's a great thing. But I think sometimes we do that to a fault, to where we believe, we know all this stuff, and we are the purveyors of truth and the owners of truth and all of that, and we don't make it personal. It becomes rote or mechanical, and so in theory it's all great, but when it becomes personal and it hits you between the eyes, well, now it's a whole different ball game. And I've seen, I've witnessed situations like that where they try to, theorize what happened and all that, when, the person that's dealing with this, hey, this is on a very personal level. And it's like, I hear what you're saying and all that, but, I'm dealing with this on a personal level. And I think that's really helped me in my ability to conduct a funeral, to, as a minister, to talk with someone who is going through this. I've sat on the side of the desk that they're on and talked to the funeral director and talked to the coroner now, and being an only child and all that, that was a whole different perspective that I'm thankful for now. And that's where you're at, because your preaching has gotten, it was always good, but I hear you preach now. There's a different level of passion and excitement when you do these grief seminars that you're doing now. You have so much more teeth to it. It's not theory. This is I've lived it, and God is using you so tremendously through this. I know it's benefiting a lot of folks, and I know that at the same time you're still struggling with it, and it's got to bring it up every time you talk about it in the grief seminars, doesn't it? I mean, bringing it to the surface.
In my seminars, I don't really get emotional talking about my son or my dad. And I think maybe in some ways I've talked about them so much, you kind of become dead inside, or it does become a little bit mechanical telling the story, etc. Where I get emotional is after the seminar is over and when people are sharing their stories, and particularly if I'm talking to someone who has also buried a child.
Yeah.
That's when I feel completely overwhelmed. That wave comes crashing in and suddenly I'm drowning. That's when I feel overwhelmed by emotion, because I know a little bit of the pain they're feeling. I know sort of what they're feeling. I know how awful that feeling is, and you hurt with them. The hurt that you feel for them and with them is what is so overwhelming, and it always seems to catch me off guard. You would think that as soon as I realize someone's going to tell me a heartbroken story of losing their child, I would brace myself emotionally for what's about to come, but it always catches me off guard. But certainly this does bring you into the place where the rubber meets the road. And I remember when my dad passed away, Dan Winkler told me something I'll never forget. He said, I've always been told that when you lose a loved one, heaven becomes a little bit more real to you. That before, it's kind of just this great place that when you die, you're going to go there and live like Bill Gates.
Right.
But then after you lose a loved one, heaven becomes, well, I want to go there because I want to be with my dad.
Yeah.
Again, I want to be with my son, etc. And that has proven absolutely true. Certainly we want to be in the presence of God and all of those things, but heaven becomes more real for you in that regard. I know that after my dad died, I lost all delusions of my own immortality. I became very comfortable with death and was okay with dying at any time.
Yeah.
When my wife came along years later, she couldn't understand that kind of morbid attitude that I had until our son died. Yeah. Said, before he died, I don't know that I had ever prayed the prayer, Lord, come quickly, with any kind of conviction.
Yeah.
But now she and I share that, one that I've had since my dad passed away, but she and I now share that longing for the second coming, that longing for his return.
Yeah.
Last year on Easter, I wrote a prayer to say at my table for Easter lunch. Last year, my family, my mom and stepdad, my sister and her husband, they were all with us for Easter. This year they couldn't be because of the social distancing. But I wrote a prayer, and I repeated the prayer yesterday in blessing Easter lunch, and it's going to be a prayer that I offer every Easter over the food for the rest of my life. In the prayer, I thank the Lord for this family and this food, but that on a day like Easter, we are reminded of those who are no longer with us, and because of that, and therefore we ask that Jesus return, and to speak his final word over death, to return and visit his people in their affliction once more, return to tread the winepress of his Father's fury, return to ransom us from the tyranny of the grave, return to lead us to a land beyond the river where there are no cemeteries.
Yeah.
But until that day comes, fill us with faith, with hope, and with love. And may our next feast be with the angelic host at the marriage supper of the Lamb in heaven.
Yeah.
The anticipation of the second coming and the end of all things becomes so much more intense in the aftermath of all this. And that can't help but spill over into every other arena of your life, in hurting with people who have loss, in being patient with people who are struggling, in being patient with people that are impatient with you because they just don't have a clue what you're going through.
Sure.
It has ramifications for every arena of life. Yeah.
Man, great stuff, Michael. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us, sharing your intellect with us. A lot of it gained from experience, but wow, this is good stuff. And I want our viewers, our listeners to know that if they have, further questions, we always make it available that they can email me at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. But Michael, tell folks how they can get a hold of you, whether to share their story with you and maybe seek some guidance, or, to schedule you for a grief seminar at one of their churches or events. Tell them how to get a hold of you.
Absolutely. So if you're interested in the grief seminar, the website is very easy to remember. Remember, lifeintheshadow.com. The grief seminar is called Life in the Shadow of Death. You can just Google Michael Whitworth and Life in the Shadow of Death, and that'll come up. Also, they can go to my company's website, starttofinish.org. That's start and then the number 2, finish.org. Several resources there. In fact, I put the grief seminar in book form since the last time we had an interview.
Good.
And that book is titled Life in the Shadow of Death. It's also available on Amazon, a great way to share the material with someone who may not be able to attend a grief seminar in person. But also they can just email me at michael@starttofinish.org. If they want to get in contact, maybe they're struggling, maybe they're looking for resources, or whatever way that I can be of assistance, I certainly want to do that.
Yeah, I was going to mention the book because it's getting good reviews. I know Chase Turner was on this podcast a couple of weeks ago, and he swears by it. And so Life in the Shadow of Death is the book. Please pick it up. I've started it. I hadn't finished it. Great book, great resource. But you're also an accomplished author in other things. So you're working through the Bible and doing commentaries. Hebrews, is it finished now?
Yes. It is drawing nigh. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Good.
The light is bright at the end of the tunnel.
Good.
And as I explained in the introduction to the book, I came to this writing project on Hebrews for some very selfish reasons. In that it has proven to be what I needed to help recover my faith after my son's death, and so a lot of that is integrated into it.
Awesome. And there's all those resources you can find on starttofinish.org. Great resource. I appreciate you being on, Michael. Thank you so much. And I appreciate all of you tuning in. Please share the word about the Dear Church podcast. We're going to continue our series on grief and looking at the loss of a spouse. We're going to look at when your spouse has Alzheimer's or dementia and how to deal with that, and then also with suicide. And so we hope you'll continue to tune into the podcast. Thank you all for watching. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you.